Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Lead with Less. I'm Tash, your host, and today I'm talking about a quite a nitty-gritty topic, which is dealing with difficult people or situations. Now, I'm talking about this topic because someone messaged me on LinkedIn and they're in a really senior position and they wanted to get my take on dealing with difficult people and situations and what my thoughts were and what were some of my insights, tools, and strategies that I would recommend when dealing with situations like this. And I'm going to share the message because I think it's a really key one. And it goes to show that no matter what level you're at, no matter how far you've gotten in life or in career or in your work, you're going to come across difficult situations, difficult people, challenges, all of these things. And they're things that you are going to need to deal with if you want to live a fulfilling life, if you want to have meaningful relationships, if you want to create meaningful impact and live with purpose. But what happens is we avoid a lot of these things, mostly because we don't actually know how to deal with them and we struggle with the emotional aspect of dealing with this. So I thought that this was a really good episode to record, and hopefully I can keep it nice and short and sharp. So the message that I received was, one topic I would love to see you cover is difficult co-workers. I'm at a head of level and I see women putting their stilettos into other women, which is quite heartbreaking actually. And I also see senior leaders struggling to lean into conversations with either difficult direct reports or peers. Avoidance seems to be the consistent strategy the more senior I go. And this is definitely something I see through all of my coaching. I coach leaders, and the discomfort of wanting to deal with these things never goes away. And unfortunately, the higher we go in our career, the more reliance that comes on us to be the ones to deal with it. Whereas when you're kind of at the starting point, you can kind of escalate it, or hopefully someone else deals with it, which also isn't necessarily the best way to go about it. And this was actually quite a timely episode to record because just this week we had a group for Thriving New Professionals, my program for early and new to career professionals, and we were talking about feedback and courageous conversations in this week's module. And a couple of the people in the group said, oh, my default is just to ghost and just not to deal with it, or to have my manager deal with it, which in some cases this can work in your favor. But as you develop in your career, as you climb the ladder, or as you get more senior, whatever your path is that you're taking, you're going to need to develop the skill set to be able to deal with these things because they're only going to get worse. In some cases, quote unquote, ghosting might be the answer to your problems, but that is only going to perpetuate that, right? If you don't actually confront and deal with the things that are going on in your life or the things that are coming up in your relationship dynamics, they're going to keep coming up because that's how it works, right? Until we learn the lesson's going to keep showing up. So, what I want to cover in this episode and hopefully make this really practical and tangible for you is what difficult situations are and how we find ourselves in them, what happens when we don't address them. So, what are the immediate things that happen, but also the long-term things that actually our brain doesn't really think about, and how to navigate difficult people and conversations to start creating better outcomes. So, I'm going to talk through my courageous conversations framework, which I think really benefits whether we're dealing with difficult people or difficult situations. So, what are difficult situations? Well, they're often a mismatch between values and or expectations. So, with regards to expectations, it's a mismatch between what we expect someone to do or what we're expecting from someone versus what we're actually getting versus what they're doing or not doing. Or there's a mismatch of values. So values are what we believe is important, what we deem is the most important to us. And when we find ourselves in tense or difficult situations is usually when someone is disrespecting our value. This can actually also be with ourselves when we're disrespecting our own values. But this is where we tend to find ourselves in difficult situations with people. It's usually a mismatch between values and or expectations. Ultimately, what comes to the crux of difficult situations is essentially the avoidance of having the conversations to resolve the situation. And as David White says, the courageous conversation is the one that you don't want to have. So I talk a lot about courageous conversations. It's something that I absolutely still find challenging. I still try and find all of the ways that I can avoid having courageous conversations, even though I coach in it, I train people on it. I'm still a human and I still struggle with it. And that just goes to show that it's a skill that we need to consistently build and consistently practice, because that's how we're going to create meaningful relationships. And often the reason that we're avoiding these situations is because they're uncomfortable and the outcome's unpredictable. And this is where Brené Brown talks about vulnerability, or yeah, with vulnerability is you're being exposed and you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what the other person's going to do or going to say or how they're going to react, which is why we tend to avoid doing that in the first place. But as with everything, the more that we avoid, the more that the problem perpetuates and gets worse. So those are the two situations where you might find this come up the most. So if you're currently experiencing some tension or some frustration, anger, sadness, disappointment, I would ask for you or encourage you to reflect, where are my expectations unmet? Where do I have a mismatch in expectations versus the reality of what I'm experiencing? Or where are my values not quite being respected, whether by someone else or by myself? And just get really, really honest. What happens when we don't deal with just difficult situations? Well, the problem remains and often gets worse. A lot of people think that if I don't deal with it, it'll go away. It might in the short term, because it's out of mind, out of sight. You might pull away from someone, you might avoid someone, you might change teams, you might change jobs, you might, you know, I don't know, you might just find some way to kind of step out of that situation. That is an immediate, I don't want to call it a solution, but that's an immediate resolve to the feeling of that frustration, anger, or tension. But the problem is still there. The challenge, the unmet expectation, the unmet values, the problem still remains, and it does get worse. Whether worse for you or whether worse for someone else, because that person's behavior or actions continue on after that. Resentment builds. When we don't deal with difficult situations or difficult people, resentment builds, right? It starts as disappointment, it starts as frustration and turns into resentment. It turns into a very toxic emotion. Resentment can then breed gossiping, complaining, all of those things, which then exacerbates toxic cultures. And through resentment, relationships deteriorate, they get worse. And also, cultures and team dynamics decrease because of tolerated behavior. So I can imagine everyone has experienced working in a team, and there's someone on the team that is either very difficult or very challenging or not performing or has very unhealthy behaviors or unhealthy interactions with people, and it's not being dealt with. And then they become a rotten apple within the basket, right? Which then starts to rot the rest of the basket, which then starts to exacerbate toxic and unhealthy behavior. And what happens is when those things are left unattended to, if they're left unresolved or not dealt with, it creates deterioration in team culture and team dynamics, because people start to get frustrated, they start to get angry, and this is where high performers tend to leave, because they're just not going to deal with it. And this is how company cultures become very toxic, because of tolerated behavior. Often I talk about with people, it's like, how did it get this bad? And it's like, because it was tolerated over time. In the conversation this week, in the coaching conversation with the Thriving New Professionals group, one participant said, oh, but sometimes things like it's just small, and why does it matter? Like, why should I even have to deal with it? And I was like, okay, in some cases that's fair. Why should I really have to kind of deal with this? It's small, it's minor. However, there's a fine line between something is just small and minor and I'm just being irritated by it, versus something is small and minor, but this is going to compound into a bigger problem over time. And very rarely big problems are big problems is a one-off thing. Often big problems are small, tiny little things that happened over time that weren't dealt with, that weren't resolved. And so they compounded into becoming big problems. So we need to be very, very careful and very mindful about what we tolerate, about what we kind of shrug off, push under the rug, just be like, oh, does it really matter? I don't really have the energy for it. We need to be really intentional about that being a good, supportive choice versus I just can't be bothered. If everyone just couldn't be bothered, there's a lot of things that would completely fall over and crumble in our day-to-day world. But there are a lot of people who are willing to be uncomfortable, who are willing to be a bit more courageous to deal with those things so they don't become problems. So now I'm going to jump into how to start navigating difficult people and difficult situations. Now, there's so much nuance to this. So I'm going to share my kind of simple framework that you can follow, but there's a lot of nuance that comes in with this, and this is a lot of the work that I do one-on-one and in my group programs, is the mindset behind each of these things, because that's usually what's causing the avoidance. It's what we think about these things. It's the emotion that we attach to these things. It's our past experience that are interlinking to these things that makes it challenging to deal with. And that's the part that I can't dive into on a podcast episode. But if this is coming up for you, definitely reach out, ask me, let's talk about it. But ultimately, these steps will be a good starting point for you to start dealing with challenges, challenging people, challenging situations in your work or in your life. This is related to any any dynamic you have with another person, regardless of the context. The first thing that I would say, and this is always a mindset reframe that I challenge people with, is consider whether someone is actually difficult or if they are just different. Consider whether someone is actually difficult or whether they are just different. Is the way that they're showing up, acting, thinking, talking, feeling actually a problem? Or is it different to how you do things? Is it different to how you are? This is a really, really, really key distinction. So often when I talk to people and I really challenge them on this, be like, are they actually difficult or are they different? Because so often we get stuck in this tunnel vision of they need to be just like me and they need to think just like me and they need to do things just like this. That's not how people are. People are unique. People are different. People have their own life experience, their own mindsets, their own beliefs, their own values, all of their things, all their own assumptions and perspectives. They can't be exactly like you. And if you are rigid in that thinking, if you're very, very fixed in that thinking, often this is what perpetuates quote unquote difficult people or difficult situations. Sometimes the person isn't actually difficult. Sometimes they're just different, or sometimes they have stuff going on that makes this a difficult period or a challenging period. So that's the first thing that I would really prompt if you're finding yourself in difficult situations with people, or if this is something that comes up quite often for you, maybe challenge that. Is this actually a problem? Are they genuinely difficult or are they different? So then following on from that, if there is a genuine problem or issue with what's going on, you need to take the time to get really crystal clear about what the issue really is. We get caught up in you always and you never, which is what creates defensive conversations, which is what makes conversations really unproductive. You need to get really crystal clear about what the problem actually is, what the issue actually is. What is it related to? What is the actionable behavior that you're actually talking about? What specific examples are you referring to? Specifics is your saving grace. The more specific you can be about when this shows up or when they do the thing or when they don't do the thing, the more that they're going to be able to talk to it, the more that they're going to be able to have a constructive conversation with you. You need to know what the actual issue is, not just what you think the issue is. What is the actual issue that you want to talk about? Then you need to check your ego. You need to check your ego and make sure that you are curious and open to having this conversation. Often what happens is this happens when people have avoided a conversation. Now it's a really big problem. And so then there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of wanting to prove rightness, being really unwilling to have a conversation, a curious conversation. And this is what creates really, really, really bad, bad situations. You need to check that you are curious and open to having a conversation with someone. Are you really willing to listen to what they have to say? Because guess what? You don't know everything. You don't know everything about everything, and you don't know everything about another person. You're seeing something, you're making an observation about what you see, and you don't have context to what else is behind that. That's what you need to find out. So you need to check your mind and check your ego, that you are not going in there trying to prove that you're right, but that you're going in there to try and have a conversation. So check that you're truly willing to listen. And then bring that person into a conversation, invite them into a conversation, and share your observation. And I say share your observation because that's all it is. All you have is an observation. All you have is a perspective of what you're seeing or what you're experiencing or what someone else has told you that you're now trying to resolve. You don't have all of the information. You need to be willing to open up that conversation. And, what I focus on is, what is the observation? What is it that you see? What is the impact that it's having? And then what is their side of the story? What is it that they can tell you about either why it's happening, why it's not happening, or context to what's going on? Because you just don't know. And assumptions are, we know what assuming does, it makes an ass out of you and me, but they're very rarely based on fact. They're based on stories that we're telling in our head. And when we have gaps in information, the brain will just make up stuff to fill the gaps. Or it'll use past information to fill those gaps, which isn't necessarily factually correct now. So you need to be willing to share that observation, say, hey, look, this is what I'm noticing, or this is what's been shared with me. I'd really like to talk about it. What's going on? Can you talk me through that process? Can you talk me through what your process was, what your thinking was? Talk me through that. Your curious questioning here is really, really powerful. Go back and have a listen to the coaching approach podcast episode that I released a few weeks ago. I'll link it in the show notes. It talks through bringing a coaching approach into the conversations that we're having. This is also really helpful here. Then actually listen. Once you share your observation, once you open that conversation, actually listen to what they have to say. Oscar Tromboli, he's a listening coach. He defines deeply listening as the willingness to have your mind changed. To truly listen to someone is having the willingness to have your mind changed. It doesn't mean your mind has to change. It doesn't mean that your mind will change, but your mind needs to be willing to be changed. Otherwise, you're not listening. Otherwise, you're just waiting to prove yourself right. You're just waiting to have your say. And then what's the point of having the conversation? Then you may as well just be that directive manager who just tells you what to do, versus being a coaching leader that goes, hey, I want to have a productive two-way conversation with you. If you're not willing to have your mind changed, you're not ready to listen. You're not ready to actually deal with what's going on. And in some cases, this is about changing your beliefs about someone. Again, when we're playing with assumptions, we often self-validate beliefs, and often they just aren't true. And so we need to be willing for that to be challenged and changed. And that can be uncomfortable. But this is how we create productive relationships with people. Once you've shared your observation, you've given them the opportunity to share their perspective, their experience. If there needs to be time to consider, now this is really important. Take breaks if you need to, because you've had time to prepare and think about this conversation. That person hasn't. They don't know everything. They didn't have all this time to think about all of these things. So they might need time to consider this, to process it, to think about it before they can give a response. Allow that time, and then make sure you set another time to come back and finish the conversation. Be willing to be flexible with how people process information. Again, Everyone is not the same. How you process information, how you consider things is not the same as someone else. So make sure you can be flexible. If you can't, question how effective you might be being with the people around you. If you can't create flexibility with the way that you interact with people and move through challenging situations, it's creating a lot. It will create a lot of issues. And then lastly, talk through options about how to move forward. In some cases, you may not 100% agree. In some cases, even though you've listened to their perspective, there might be rigid policies, processes in place where you're like, you know what, I get why, I get where you're coming from. Unfortunately, this is the way it has to be done because of blah, 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 and give specific reasoning to why. Specifics help people understand. Don't be a hard ass just because, just because you're annoyed. Make sure you have very specific reasoning to why someone has to do something a certain way. If there is flexibility to something being done differently, or maybe there's something you've actually learned through this process to be like, wow, I never considered that. I never thought that this is actually a problem. I never thought that this is actually an issue. This has given me food for thought. Maybe we need to look at changing this process. Maybe we need to look at doing this thing differently. How can we do that? Do you have thoughts? Let's put that onto paper and let's rejig the process. Be willing to be flexible. This is one of the things that I talked about in the strategic thinking episode that I released a few weeks ago as well. And we'll link that in the show notes. Being flexible in the way that you think, being flexible in your perspectives and your beliefs is a key trait of being a strategic thinker. If you want to be strategic and develop in your career, you have to practice being flexible. You have to practice being open to doing things differently, to being challenged in the way that you think, because that means that you're willing to grow. That means that you're willing to admit that you don't know everything about everything. And that's just part of being human. It's part of being human. So, those are the 7 steps to how I deal with difficult situations and deal with difficult people. As I mentioned, there is nuance to this. There is all of your mindset, there's all of your past experience that will come into play here. And if you know that that's something that blocks you, reach out and let's talk about it. Maybe we can do some coaching together to help and to help release those blocks, to help reshape that mindset so that you can move through this in a really powerful way. So I'll just go through them again. Number 1 is consider whether someone is actually difficult or whether they're just different. Really check yourself in the way that you're approaching it and your perspective. If there is a genuine problem, get really crystal clear about what the actual problem is, what the real issue is, and what the examples are that you are talking about in terms of this. Check your ego and make sure that you're actually curious and open to having a conversation with someone and being willing to have your mind changed. Make sure that you are not going in there to prove yourself right, but that you're willing to have a two-way conversation. Share your observation that invites conversation and curiosity. Hey, this is my information. This is my observation. This is what I saw. This is what I've been told. I'd really like to understand what was going on for you. What was happening? What was your process? What was your thinking? Talk me through that. And then actually listen. Actually listen to what they have to say. You don't know everything about everything. Be willing to have your mind changed so that you can expand the way that you think and you can really create productive outcomes and solutions with the people around you. Take a break for processing if you need to. Again, make sure that you come back and close that conversation and talk through options on a way forward. If there is a very certain way that something has to be done, make sure you've got specifics and evidence to prove why that is the case. Otherwise, be willing to create some really good open solutions to move forward. Now, as always, I'm going to share a few mindset reminders just to help you and just to remember when you might be encountering difficult situations or difficult issues around you. So, number 1, sometimes people aren't difficult, sometimes they're just different. Where can you get out of your own head and experience and create space to see another perspective? Where can you actually get outside of your own viewpoint and look at what is actually going on and being willing to see different things? It's not about being right. When we're dealing with quote unquote difficult people, it isn't actually about being right. It's actually about understanding what's going on because you don't know it. You don't know everything, right? especially when it comes to other people. Be willing to talk about things and to expand your own thinking. And lastly, avoidance makes things worse. Sure, maybe you feel a bit more comfortable in the short term because you're just not dealing with the problem, but it's going to come back and bite you. It's going to come back, it's going to keep rearing its head, and it's whether it's not right now, whether it's later down the track, it's going to keep becoming a problem. And I know that from personal experience, I avoided talking about things that I struggled with, talking about things that I found really irritating, frustrating, and it built a lot of resentment, especially in my career. There were a lot of things that I didn't address head on, and it crippled me. It crippled me in a lot of ways. It kept me stuck in my career. And until I started leaning into being courageous, leaning into that vulnerability, leaning into, hey, I don't know how this is going to go, but what's important is that I talk about it. What's important is that I share my observations so that I can potentially change an outcome. Things really started to change. So I would absolutely recommend that, even if it's scary, even if it's uncomfortable, to lean into it. Because the more that these things are left unresolved, the more that we avoid these things, we ghost these things, we just pretend that they're not happening, the more that we actually perpetuate toxic and unhealthy cultures, whether that's or just unhealthy relationship dynamics, whether that's at work, in our personal life, our families, whatever. Avoidance creates more problems. I hope that this episode was helpful. I hope that this provides you a framework to work through to get started with on of dealing with difficult situations. The other thing that I would also say is think about them as uncomfortable situations or challenging situations. Challenge means that we can rise up to that and move through them. When we talk about hard or difficult, we really perpetuate that feeling that something is going to be difficult or hard. So I would just recommend just thinking about some of the language that you're using around some of this and seeing how changing that language might help you to feel differently. So I'm going to leave that there. If you have any thoughts about this, please leave a comment on Spotify in the Q&A down the bottom of this episode, or message me on Instagram or LinkedIn, or flick me an email and let me know what you thought. If you've got any questions about this, if this is something that you find really challenging and that you're noticing is becoming an ongoing problem in the way that you're developing across your career or your life, definitely reach out and let's see if we can do some work to help move through that. So thank you again. Let me know what you think about this episode, and I'll see you back next week.